War movies are supposed to inspire pride or deliver spectacle. These films did neither, at least not in the way audiences expected. When they first hit theaters, they confused viewers, unsettled critics, and failed commercially. But time changed everything. Freed from box office expectations, these films were re-examined, reinterpreted, and ultimately reclaimed. What once felt uncomfortable now feels honest. This is the story of 12 war movies that failed loudly, then refused to die. Number 12, Johnny Got His Gun, 1971. When Johnny Got His Gun arrived in theaters, it was met with silence, discomfort, and outright rejection. Audiences raised on heroic battlefield narratives were not prepared for a war film that barely shows combat at all. Or instead, the film traps viewers inside the mind of a soldier who has lost his limbs, his face, his voice, and his senses. He is alive, yet completely imprisoned. In 1971, at the height of Vietnam War fatigue, this was not the kind of confrontation moviegoers wanted to endure. The film's commercial failure was almost inevitable. It offers no release, no traditional arc, and no comfort. Dialogue is sparse. The camera lingers. Time feels suspended. Director Dalton Trumbo adapted his own novel with ruthless discipline, refusing to soften its message. War here is not chaos or glory. It is erasure. Identity, memory, and autonomy are stripped away one by one until nothing remains but consciousness and regret. For mainstream audiences, this was unbearable. For studios, it was unmarketable. But over time, Johnny Got His Gun found a second life. The college campuses revived it. Anti-war movements embraced it. Metallica famously embedded its imagery into popular culture decades later, introducing it to an entirely new generation. What once seemed too bleak became essential. The film's refusal to entertain now reads as moral clarity. Its minimalism feels intentional rather than punishing. Its stillness becomes its power. Today, the film is regarded as one of the most uncompromising anti-war statements ever put on screen. It is not watched casually. It is endured, remembered, and discussed. That endurance is precisely why it survived its initial failure. In refusing to please anyone, Johnny Got His Gun ultimately said something too important to forget. Number 11, The Steel Helmet, 1951. Or released during the Korean War itself, The Steel Helmet shocked audiences by how quickly and bluntly it arrived. There was no patriotic distance, no historical framing, and no polished heroism. Director Samuel Fuller, a combat veteran himself, shot the film on a shoestring budget with raw urgency. What audiences expected was reassurance. What they got was cynicism, fear, and moral ambiguity. As a result, the film struggled commercially and unsettled critics who did not know how to categorize it. Unlike traditional war films of the era, this one refuses to present clean archetypes. Soldiers argue, insult each other, and question why they are even there. The film directly addresses racism, religion, and the psychological toll of constant threat. It even portrays American soldiers behaving cruelly and irrationally, something nearly unthinkable in early 1950s Hollywood. For contemporary viewers, this felt unpatriotic. For studios, it was dangerous. Yet this immediacy is exactly what later generations responded to. The Steel Helmet feels less like a production and more like a document. The cheap sets, the blunt dialogue, and the lack of sentimentality give it an authenticity that studio war films lacked. Fuller did not mythologize war because he had lived it. He understood that confusion and contradiction were more truthful than speeches and swelling music. Over time, critics reevaluated the film as a precursor to modern war cinema. Its influence can be seen in later films that rejected clean narratives in favor of fractured perspectives. What once felt abrasive now feels honest. The Steel Helmet did not fail because it was bad. It failed because it arrived before audiences were ready to see themselves reflected so harshly. Number 10, Gallipoli, 1981. When Gallipoli opened in 1981, expectations were dangerously misaligned. Audiences anticipated a traditional war epic built around battlefield spectacle and patriotic triumph. What they received instead was a slow-burning meditation on youth nationalism and tragic inevitability. The film performed modestly in its home country and underwhelmingly elsewhere. For international audiences especially, it felt quiet, restrained, and emotionally devastating rather than rousing. In commercial terms, it never found the wide audience its ambition deserved. Director Peter Weir structured the film to delay war as long as possible. Much of the runtime follows two young Australian runners whose friendship is forged not in combat, but in optimism, innocence, and physical freedom. This was a risky choice. The film asks viewers to invest deeply in lives that history has already doomed. When the battlefield finally arrives, it is not thrilling. It is abrupt, claustrophobic, and fatal. The famous final moments deny catharsis entirely. That refusal left many viewers shaken rather than satisfied. At the time, this approach confused audiences raised on clear war narratives. There are no villains to hate and no victories to celebrate. Instead, the enemy is bureaucracy, miscommunication, and blind loyalty to empire. The tragedy is systemic rather than personal. personal. In 1981, this felt alienating. The box office reflected that discomfort. Gallipoli was respected but not embraced. Over time, however, the film grew in stature. Historians praised its accuracy. Critics reevaluated its restraint as emotional intelligence rather than weakness. Younger audiences found its anti-war message clearer with distance from nationalist fervor. The final sequence, once criticized for its bleakness, became iconic precisely because it refuses to soften the truth. The running motif, once seen as sentimental, became symbolic of wasted potential. Today, Gallipoli is regarded as one of the most important war films ever made outside Hollywood. Its cult status comes not from shock or excess, but from discipline and empathy. It did not fail because it lacked power. It failed because it asked viewers to mourn rather than cheer, and mourning takes time. Number 9. The Duelists, 1977. Ridley Scott's debut feature arrived quietly in 1977, overshadowed by louder war films and misunderstood by audiences expecting spectacle. The Duelist is technically a war film, but it resists nearly every convention of the genre. Battles happen off-screen. Politics fade into the background. The Napoleonic Wars are treated not as a narrative engine, but as an ever-shifting backdrop to an obsessive personal feud. That subtlety proved costly at the box office. The film follows two French officers locked in a decades-long cycle of honor violence and resentment. Their duels continue as regimes fall, borders shift, and history marches forward without them. This structure baffled audiences. There is no clear moral victory and no transformation arc. The characters do not learn, they persist. A war here is not chaos, but stagnation, a machine that preserves outdated ideas of honor long after their meaning has eroded. Visually, the film is meticulous. Scott's painterly compositions draw from period art, creating frames that feel frozen in time. In 1977, this visual precision felt distant rather than immersive. The film demanded patience at a moment when audiences wanted momentum. As a result, The Duelist struggled commercially despite strong critical notices. Its reputation grew slowly through cinephile circles and home video. Scholars and filmmakers began citing it as a masterclass in visual storytelling and thematic restraint. What once felt cold now reads as deliberate detachment. The duels become symbols of how war traps individuals in cycles they cannot escape. The absence of spectacle becomes the point. Violence is repetitive, not glorious. Today, The Duelist is considered a cult classic precisely because it refuses immediacy. It rewards repeat viewing and thoughtful engagement. Ridley Scott would later become known for scale and intensity, but this film endures as his most controlled statement on war. It did not fail because it was small. It failed because it was too precise for its time. Number 8. A Midnight Clear, 1992. A Midnight Clear arrived quietly in 1992 and disappeared just as quickly. Released during a period dominated by large-scale prestige war films and rising action-driven narratives, it felt strangely intimate and deliberately small. Audiences expecting World War II heroics were instead given a winter-bound chamber piece about fear, uncertainty, and the fragile line between enemy and human being. The box office response was muted, and the film slipped into obscurity almost immediately. Set during the final days of the war, the story follows a group of American soldiers occupying an abandoned mansion near the German front. Combat is distant and almost incidental. What drives the film is tension born from silence, waiting, and misunderstanding. When the soldiers encounter a group of young German troops, the situation becomes tragically ambiguous. No one wants to fight. Everyone is afraid. Orders exist, but certainty does not. At the time, this approach felt anticlimactic. The film denies viewers traditional release. There are no sweeping victories, no rousing speeches, and no clear moral triumph. Violence erupts suddenly and without glory. When it does, it feels accidental rather than heroic. For mainstream audiences, this restraint read as inertia. For studios, it meant poor marketability. Over time, however, the film's reputation changed. Critics revisiting it noted how closely it aligns with lived wartime testimony rather than myth. The soldiers are young, confused, and painfully aware that survival often depends on luck rather than bravery. The snow-covered landscapes emphasize isolation rather than beauty. The quiet becomes oppressive. The final moments linger not because they shock, but because they feel inevitable. Today, A Midnight Clear is widely regarded as one of the most humane war films ever made. Its cult status comes from its emotional precision and its refusal to simplify. It does not argue that war is hell through spectacle. It shows how war erodes judgment, compassion, and identity through waiting, misunderstanding, and fear. Its initial failure now feels like proof that audiences were not yet ready for such honesty. Number 7. The Beast, 1988. When The Beast was released in 1988, it found itself trapped between political discomfort and marketing confusion. A war film told largely from the perspective of Soviet soldiers during the Afghan conflict was a hard sell during the late Cold War. American audiences were unsure how to engage with a story that humanized perceived enemies. As a result, the film struggled commercially despite strong performances and a gripping premise. The story centers on a Soviet tank crew lost in hostile territory after committing an act of brutality against civilians. What follows is less a combat narrative than a psychological unraveling. The tank becomes a moving prison. Authority collapses. Paranoia replaces ideology. The war itself fades into a relentless landscape that punishes everyone equally. There are no heroes here, only people making increasingly desperate choices. At the time, this moral ambiguity unsettled viewers. The film refuses to frame its characters as villains or martyrs. Instead, it portrays war as a system that dehumanizes all participants regardless of uniform. This perspective clashed with popular narratives of the era which favored clear alignments and righteous outcomes. Without that clarity, audiences disengaged. Over the years, The Beast gained appreciation for its thematic bravery. Critics praised its tension, its performances, and its refusal to offer easy answers. The Afghan setting, once considered politically awkward, now feels prescient. The film explores the futility of occupation, the limits of military power, and the corrosive effects of violence on those who wield it. Today, the film is regarded as a cult classic precisely because it challenged Cold War simplifications. Its reputation grew through home video and late-night screenings where its bleak atmosphere and moral complexity found the right audience. The Beast did not fail because it lacked intensity. It failed because it asked viewers to empathize across enemy lines, and that empathy took time to develop. Number 6. Breaker Morant, 1980. When Breaker Morant reached theaters in 1980, it arrived burdened by expectations it had no interest in fulfilling. Audiences anticipated a courtroom drama with patriotic reassurance or a conventional colonial war narrative. Instead, they were confronted with a morally destabilizing examination of empire responsibility and scapegoating. The film earned respect but not box office momentum, especially outside Australia, where its historical context was unfamiliar and its conclusions deeply uncomfortable. Set during the Second Boer War, the film centers on Australian soldiers tried by the British military for executing prisoners. What makes the story incendiary is not the question of guilt, but the question of power. The accused are not portrayed as heroes, yet the trial itself is exposed as political theater designed to protect imperial optics rather than justice. The film refuses to resolve this tension cleanly. Responsibility is diffuse. Blame is selective. Truth is inconvenient. In 1980, this ambiguity limited the film's reach. Viewers expecting closure instead received moral unease. The courtroom scenes are procedural yet emotionally charged, revealing how bureaucracy can weaponize legality to absolve itself. The war itself remains largely unseen, emphasizing that decisions made far from the battlefield often determine who pays the price. For mainstream audiences, this critique of authority landed awkwardly. Over time, Breaker Morant gained recognition as one of the most incisive war films ever made. Legal scholars, historians, and filmmakers praised its clarity and restraint. Its dialogue became widely quoted. Its depiction of imperial hypocrisy resonated strongly in post-colonial discourse. What once felt niche became universal. Today, the film's cult status rests on its intellectual rigor. It does not argue innocence or guilt. It exposes systems that demand obedience, then deny accountability. Its initial failure now reads as evidence of how threatening its ideas were. Breaker Morant endured because it speaks less about one war than about how wars are managed, narrated, and morally outsourced. Number 5. Heaven and Earth, 1993. Oliver Stone's Heaven and Earth arrived in 1993 as the final chapter of his Vietnam trilogy and was swiftly ignored. Coming after the success of Platoon and Born on the 4th of July, audiences expected another visceral indictment delivered through familiar emotional beats. Instead, Stone shifted perspective, entirely focusing on a Vietnamese woman whose life is shaped and shattered by forces beyond her control. The result was commercially disastrous. The film traces the life of Lê Ly from rural Vietnam through war trauma displacement and eventual immigration to the United States. War here is not a series of battles, but an omnipresent pressure that invades homes, families, and identities. The violence is personal, repetitive, and often unseen. Stone strips away spectacle and enters survival rather than heroism. This choice alienated viewers who expected confrontation rather than contemplation. At the time, critics struggled with the film's tone. It was accused of being unfocused or emotionally distant. In reality, it refused Western narrative dominance. The story does not build toward victory or resolution. It drifts, survives, and adapts, mirroring the lived experience of civilians caught in war's wake. That refusal to prioritize American perspective limited its appeal. With distance, the film has been reevaluated as one of the most radical war films of the era. Scholars praised its attempt to decentralize American trauma and foreground Vietnamese experience. Its emotional restraint, once criticized, is now seen as respect. The film's quiet moments carry weight precisely because they are not dramatized. Today, Heaven and Earth is regarded as a cult classic for viewers seeking a broader understanding of Vietnam beyond battlefield mythology. Its failure was not artistic, it was contextual. The audience it needed had not yet learned how to listen. Number 4. The Thin Red Line, 1990. 1998. When The Thin Red Line premiered in 1998, it stood in stark contrast to expectations shaped by conventional war cinema. Yet released the same year as a more visceral, combat-focused counterpart, audiences were unprepared for Terrence Malick's philosophical meditation on nature, consciousness, and mortality. Despite critical acclaim, the film underperformed commercially, leaving many confused by its structure and tone. The film depicts the Battle of Guadalcanal, but treats combat as only one layer of a much larger inquiry. Soldiers drift in and out of focus. Voiceovers question existence, morality, and the natural world. Violence erupts suddenly, then recedes. Nature remains indifferent. For viewers expecting narrative momentum, this felt disorienting. At the time, critics admired its ambition but acknowledged its alienating effect. The film resists identification with a single protagonist. Death arrives without narrative payoff. But war is framed not as chaos, but as an intrusion into an ancient ecosystem that neither understands nor cares. This perspective challenged genre expectations and limited repeat viewings initially. Over time, the film's reputation grew immensely. Scholars and filmmakers cited it as one of the most profound war films ever made. Its refusal to simplify became its strength. The fragmented structure mirrored psychological experience rather than plot mechanics. What once felt slow became meditative. What once felt abstract became emotionally resonant. Today, The Thin Red Line is firmly established as a cult classic whose influence continues to expand. Its initial box office failure now seems irrelevant to its lasting impact. The film endures because it asks questions war films rarely dare to ask and refuses to answer them. Number 3, Cross of Iron, 1977. When Cross of Iron was released in 1977, it was quickly labeled cynical, abrasive, and uncommercial. Audiences were unsettled by a World War II film told almost entirely from the German side that refused redemption, patriotism, or moral comfort. Director Sam Peckinpah was already controversial, and this film amplified every criticism leveled against him. The box office response was weak, and the film was largely dismissed on release. Rather than portraying ideology, Cross of Iron focuses on class resentment and the futility of command. The soldiers are exhausted, bitter, and trapped between survival and obedience. Officers pursue medals while men die anonymously in mud and snow. Peckinpah strips the war of narrative progress. Every battle feels like repetition. Every order feels hollow. This violence is brutal, sudden, and often meaningless. At the time, this perspective alienated audiences who wanted either heroic Germans or villainous ones. The film offers neither. Its characters are morally compromised survivors clinging to fragments of dignity. The tone is nihilistic, bordering on despair. Studios struggled to market a war film that actively rejects heroism. Over time, however, Cross of Iron gained a fierce cult following. Critics reevaluated it as one of the most honest depictions of combat psychology ever filmed. Its anti-authoritarian themes resonated with later generations skeptical of military myth-making. The German perspective, once controversial, now felt essential. The film's refusal to moralize allowed viewers to confront war as a system rather than a story. Today, Cross of Iron is widely regarded as Peckinpah's war masterpiece. Its initial failure now reads as proof of how uncompromising it was. It survived because it refused to lie. Number 2, The Big Red One, 1980. The Big Red One arrived in 1980, burdened by studio interference and audience confusion. Director Samuel Fuller intended the film as a personal statement drawn from his own combat experience. What reached theaters was a heavily cut version that felt episodic and strangely muted. Audiences expecting a traditional war epic found something quieter, less triumphant, and structurally unconventional. The box office reflected that disconnect. The film follows a group of infantrymen across multiple fronts of World War II. There is no single mission and no clear climax. Battles begin and end abruptly. Your death is treated as routine rather than dramatic. Fuller's intention was realism. War is not a sequence of highlights, but a long grind punctuated by random loss. In 1980, this approach felt underwhelming to viewers conditioned by spectacle. Critics were divided. Some recognized the film's authenticity, while others saw it as unfinished. Without Fuller's intended cut, the film struggled to articulate its deeper themes. As a result, it faded quickly from public consciousness. Decades later, the restored version transformed its reputation. With scenes reinstated, the film's emotional through line became clear. The quiet moments, the repetition, and the lack of sentimentality now felt deliberate. Scholars praised its depiction of survival as endurance rather than valor. Fuller's voice finally emerged intact. So today, The Big Red One is considered a cornerstone of modern war cinema. Its cult status rests on honesty earned through lived experience. It did not fail because it lacked power. It failed because its truth was edited out temporarily. Number 1, Come and See, 1985. When Come and See was released in 1985, it was too overwhelming to succeed commercially. Audiences were not prepared for its intensity, its cruelty, or its refusal to provide emotional shelter. The film was not entertaining. entertaining. It was confrontational. As a result, it struggled to find wide distribution and was rarely screened outside cinephile circles for years. The story follows a Belarusian boy whose innocence is systematically annihilated by Nazi occupation. The film uses sound design, framing, and performance to trap the viewer inside psychological collapse. Violence is not stylized, it is endured. The camera lingers not on action but on faces registering irreversible trauma. There is no relief and no escape. At the time, this extremity limited its reach. Viewers found it unbearable. Critics recognized its importance but struggled to recommend it. It existed outside traditional war film language. There were no heroes, no lessons, and no redemption. Over time, Come and See became recognized as one of the greatest war films ever made. Its cult status emerged through reverence rather than affection. Filmmakers cited it as definitive. Historians praised its accuracy. Its brutality came to be understood not as excess, but as ethical refusal to soften genocide. Today, the film stands at the peak of war cinema, not because it is admired, but because it is respected. It did not fail because it was misunderstood. It failed because it told the truth too clearly. Time caught up. These films failed because they rejected comfort, clarity, and applause. They asked audiences to sit with confusion, grief, and moral unease. History eventually rewarded that honesty. Box office numbers faded. What remained were truths that refused to age. Cult classics are not born from success. They are earned through endurance.